Hey guys, one of the most obvious things I find when discussing the World Trade Center collapse on 9/11 is just how many 9/11 conspiracy theorists don't actually know how the towers collapsed. While they argue that the official story is impossible, 95% of them don't actually know what the official cause of collapse was. I think if more people who believe 9/11 was an inside job knew exactly how the towers fell, they wouldn't find it so hard to believe. So this video is going to go over the collapse of the World Trade Center. And as usual, I'm going to break this video down into several parts. Part 1. The World Trade Center's unique construction compared to other high-rise buildings, and why that unique construction led to fatal flaws. Part 2. What initiated the collapse. Part 3. Why that failure caused the collapse of the entire building below it. And Part 4. The myths. Part 1. The construction and the flaws. The simple fact is the Twin Towers were built very differently to other tall buildings. This is significantly important because it helps explain what we witnessed. Most tall buildings are constructed with a grid frame of columns, equally spaced to distribute the loads evenly throughout the building. This grid construction creates a very strong building. However, it comes with one big downside, a decrease in rentable space. To increase rentable space and give the large open-plan customizable workspace that tenants wanted, the tower's structure was uniquely designed. Instead of this grid of columns evenly spaced throughout the building, the Twin Towers pushed these columns to the perimeter, creating a radically new building design called a framed tube. Bridging these perimeter and core columns together were hundreds of floor truss systems. The force of the Twin Towers' weight was now supported by two separate parts, the core, which supported about 60% of the building's weight, and the perimeter columns, which now supported the remaining 40%. This radically unique tube design allowed for the construction of New York's tallest buildings with a staggering 40% less steel than it would have otherwise needed if it had been constructed with a traditional grid design. This gave the open office space the designers and renters wanted, but it turned out to yield several fatal design flaws. The use of long span floor trusses, combined with the reliance on spray-on fireproofing, and the decision to use prefabricated external columns. Allow me to explain further. First, the long span floor trusses, some as long as 60 feet, while strong enough to do the job they were designed for, were essentially only made of just 1-inch lightweight steel bars. Being constructed of lightweight steel meant that it wouldn't take a lot of heat before these floor trusses would begin to lose strength and buckle. To compensate for this vulnerability, the designers coated the steel with spray-on fireproofing. This is where the next fatal flaw comes into play, the fireproofing. Typically, high-rise buildings are built with either a concrete core and/or concrete-encased steel columns. This is because concrete survives fire significantly longer than naked steel does. The Twin Towers had neither. Instead, the towers relied on a layer of spray-on fireproofing. The theory was, if a fire broke out, the fireproofing would provide 3 hours of protection, in which time the firefighters would extinguish the fire. And indeed, this is exactly what happened in February 1975. A fire broke out on the 11th floor of the North Tower. 132 firefighters descended on the building and extinguished the fire. Despite spreading through the core to several floors, the fire was mainly contained to the 11th floor, and the fireproofing protected the steel. However, by 2001, the spray-on fireproofing was showing its age. Several inspections of the fireproofing, spanning between 1993 and 2000, showed gaps where this fireproofing had broken off. Although works to thicken this fireproofing protection had been done by 2001, including all the impact floors in the North Tower and up to the 78th floor in the South Tower. But the fireproofing also showed to be quite susceptible to explosions, and from the inspection of the impact holes we can see that the collision and subsequent explosion of the airliners stripped the steel of most its fireproofing, leaving it naked and exposed to the heat of the fires. The heating, weakening, sagging and buckling of these unprotected floor trusses would put significant stress on the third fatal design flaw, the prefabricated external columns. For their size, the Twin Towers were built at record pace. One key reason for this speed is that many of the components were prefabricated before being hoisted and bolted into place. And this is where a significant weakness makes itself known. The strength of the perimeter columns to any lateral or sideways forces was only as strong as literally the bolts holding them together. Part 2. So, what happened? The impact of the airliners resulted in 3 events. They severed and damaged multiple core and perimeter columns. They blasted away the spray-on fireproofing, leaving the steel exposed. And the dispersal of 10,000 gallons of jet fuel instantly ignited massive fires on multiple floors. Once these fires started, most of the jet fuel burnt itself off within about 15 minutes. What remained was several floors of uncontrollable and massive office fires. Office buildings contain huge amounts of equipment. Most is plastic-based office equipment. With plenty of plastic equipment to fuel massive fires, and plenty of oxygen rushing into the impact zones from the big holes left by the airliners, the fires in the towers became a furnace that reached temperatures of 1800 degrees Fahrenheit or 1000 degrees Celsius. Without sufficient fireproofing, after almost an hour of intense fire, the floor trusses began to weaken and sag. As the floor trusses sagged, they began pulling on the perimeter columns, bowing them inwards. Several photos and videos show this happening. Not only do we see sagging floors, but we also see the perimeter columns bowing on both the South Tower and the North Tower prior to their failure. The sagging of the floor trusses continued to pull inwards on the perimeter columns, until eventually the bolts holding together these perimeter columns snapped. And as these bolts began to snap, it led to a chain reaction of other bolts failing along the front of these buildings. Just like any other structure, as soon as these points fail, the rest of it began to fail. As the perimeter columns failed, the top section of the building began to move downwards. Once that top section started moving, there was nothing that was going to stop that building coming straight down, pancaking the floors below it all the way to the ground. Part 3. Why did the top section crush the intact bottom section? Quite simply, mass and gravity. It's simple to think of the towers like they're some sort of solid object, like a tree trunk, but they were anything but. The towers were in fact about 90% air. What structure there was held together by bolts. The only part that can be said to be solid-like was the core. However, videos of both towers collapsing show that the core of both towers remained standing momentarily after the perimeter columns and the floors had fallen away, meaning that the resistance from the core played little role in the collapse of the towers. I think what a lot of conspiracy theorists get caught up on here is that they cannot imagine just how huge these buildings were. These buildings were massive. Each tower weighed 250 million kilograms. The top 30 floors above the impact zone alone weighed 60 million kilograms. That's 10 million kilograms heavier than the Titanic, for God's sakes. When that amount of weight starts moving with gravity, the sheer release of kinetic energy is huge. Keep in mind, this falling mass wasn't being resisted by the core. It was landing on the floors. Literally, the building was as strong as the bolts holding it together. To give other real-world examples of just how effective gravity and the release of kinetic energy is at demolishing buildings, there is a building demolition technique which uses no explosives called vernage. This demolition technique weakens a couple of the floors around midway up the building and then uses cables, rams or jacks to dislodge the support from one of those floors and allows the top section to collapse onto the bottom section, crushing both all the way to the ground. This technique has been used dozens and dozens of times. And this demonstrates just how a falling top section of building will not only happily fall through the structure below it at near free fall speed, but that the structure below it lacks any sufficient resistance to either reduce the rate the top section is accelerating through it or stop it entirely. Part 4. The Myths. The conspiracy theories surrounding the Twin Towers are far too numerous to talk about here. I do plan to address most of them in their own separate video, so keep an eye on the channel for those. Instead, I will briefly go through 5 of the more common myths. Jet fuel can't melt steel beams. Yes, I realise this is more of a meme at this point, but many people out there still maintain that the official explanation of the collapse is that jet fuel melted the steel and caused the buildings to fall. This is simply a gross misrepresentation of the official explanation. First, most of the jet fuel was burnt off within the first 15 minutes, but its damage had already been done. What the dispersal of 10,000 gallons of jet fuel throughout multiple floors in the towers did was instantly ignited a huge multi-floor inferno. Office fires, filled with lots of plastic-based office equipment, burn very hot. As mentioned, the fire reached 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, and while steel doesn't melt until 2700 degrees Fahrenheit, at just 1100 degrees Fahrenheit, steel will lose half its strength. By 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, some of that steel only had about 20% of its strength remaining. The widespread and large office fires weakened the steel and caused it to fail. No steel was melted by jet fuel. And nor has any official explanation or engineering report said that jet fuel melted steel. The buildings were designed to survive the impact of a Boeing 707. It has been stated within a 1200-page document from the Port Authority by World Trade Center engineer John Skilling that the buildings could survive the impact of a Boeing 707. However, despite a thorough investigation by NIST, no calculations to support this claim were ever found. If some calculations ever did exist, it likely only accounted for the raw impact damage and nothing else, because complex and accurate analysis of impact damage, fuel dispersal, and fire spread took NIST specialized software running on large computers to calculate, and that was far beyond the technology available to John Skilling in the 1960s. Leslie Robertson, the lead structural engineer from the Twin Towers, lays this out even clearer.
We had designed the project for the impact of the largest airplane of its time, the Boeing 707. The 767 that actually hit the World Trade Center was quite another matter again. First of all, it was a bit heavier than the 707, not very much heavier, but a bit heavier. But mostly it was flying a lot faster. And the energy that it put into the building is proportional to the square of the velocity. As you double the velocity, 4 times the energy, triple the velocity, 8 times the energy, and so forth. And then, of course, with the 707, to the best of my knowledge, the fuel load was not considered in the design. And indeed, I don't know how it could have been considered. And with the 767, the fuel load was enormous compared to that of the 707. It was a fully fueled airplane compared to the 707, which was a landing aircraft. Just absolutely no comparison between the two.
The 707, which the building was designed to survive, was to be flying at landing speeds, not deliberately rammed at 500 miles per hour into the building. Furthermore, Leslie states the fuel load was never considered, and indeed doesn't know how it could have been considered in the design. But despite that, the main failings with this myth is that the buildings in fact did survive the impacts. Both towers stood for an hour or more after being hit, and that allowed 40,000 people to escape those buildings. In the end, it was the massive fires ignited by this incalculable fuel load that brought the towers down. First responders heard explosions. Okay, yes, but explosions do not mean bombs. And aside from that, if you go through all of the first responders' quotes that mention explosions, you find that literally 90% of them are referring to either the impact of United 175 into the South Tower or the collapse of the towers themselves. As for the remaining 10%, well, there are lots of things in office fires that explode. The buildings were full of electrical transformers. This is what they sound like when they explode. There's also compressed cylinders, large debris falling from the building and hitting the ground, burning cars and trucks exploding. Heck, even the sound of the 200 people who jumped from the buildings were described by some as sounding like a bomb when they hit the ground. To give an example away from 9/11, when this crane blew a bolt and then collapsed, it was described as sounding like a bomb went off.
The hell is it? What's going on here? Okay, watch it, watch it! Shit!
These are just examples of people using similes, which is a way to compare one thing with an entirely different thing to make it more descriptive and vivid. Loud sounds and explosions often get attributed to sounding like a bomb. This certainly does not mean there were actually bombs going off. And even with the speculation among some first responders that day that there were secondary devices in the building, that is totally understandable on a day where airliners are crashing, buildings are falling, debris is landing everywhere, and explosions are going off all around you. This does not mean that there were actually bombs in the building. This is a reason why first-hand eyewitnesses can only ever be as reliable as the physical evidence that supports their statement. Everyone experiences and processes information differently. The lobby and basement were blown out when firefighters arrived. When the Norday brothers filmed the very first of the firefighters entering the North Tower lobby that morning, there were several things to note in the footage. Huge marble panels had broken off the walls and were shattered on the ground. Many of the windows on the ground floor were smashed, and people with severe burns were being treated in the lobby.
I go in and I hear screams, and right to my right there is 2 people on fire, burning.
A common myth is that this damage and those injuries were the result of bombs in the lobby and basement. However, this doesn't make sense for a couple of reasons. First, the injuries in the lobby area were burns, not contusions or lacerations. Burns. Let's be very clear, if you're close enough to a bomb to get burnt by it, you're going to be in pieces. Bombs work by putting as much energy as possible into creating a pressure shockwave to smash anything in its path. Burning people is not what a bomb is designed to do. If you're close enough to a bomb to get burnt by it, you're dead. Secondly, the collapse of both towers began at the impact zones. They fell from the top down. Not only that, but as already shown, footage from both towers show that the cores of both buildings remained standing momentarily after the rest of the building had collapsed. So based on those 2 points, what would be the purpose of having bombs in the lobby or basement? There was literally zero reason to have bombs in the lobby or basement. All it does is overcomplicate an already overcomplicated conspiracy and further risk the truth being exposed when people start asking, hang on, what's happened here? Here is what actually happened. When the planes hit the towers, 2 things are recorded to have followed. 1, the towers swayed, a lot, and 2, a fireball of jet fuel poured down the elevator shafts and burst onto several floors, including the lobby and the basement. If we look at this video of United 175 hitting the South Tower, and we speed it up, you can see just how significantly the towers swayed back and forth after the airliners hit them. This swaying is fine for the majority of the building, but what about where the building is fixed to the ground and can't sway? Because it's anchored to the ground, it can't move, and this now becomes the pivot point and takes all of the twisting forces from the building swaying above. Anything at the base that isn't able to twist and flex, such as glass and marble, will instead crack and break. This is why we see the lobby is so smashed when the firefighters arrive. We also know from many eyewitnesses in the towers who saw the fireball and or smelled the kerosene that a fireball rushed down the service elevator shafts and blew out in the lobby and basement. This fireball and or kerosene smell was witnessed on over a dozen floors throughout the buildings and is responsible for the burns inflicted onto many people in those buildings. Videos show molten steel pouring out of the towers before it collapses. This must be evidence of thermite. Not at all. The truth is, we don't actually know what kind of molten metal it is, but we can point to a likely suspect. A Boeing 767 is made of literally tens of thousands of kilograms of aluminium. Each 767 also contains hundreds of kilograms of copper wiring. Copper melts at 1100 degrees Fahrenheit. Aluminium melts at 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. The fires in that area where the molten metal is coming out of was 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. These metals from the airliner, plus everything else which was burning up there, mixed and combined into these pools of metal. As the floors sagged, this molten metal then began to pour out the side of the tower. There is zero evidence that this molten material is steel, and there is zero evidence that there was any molten steel found at the World Trade Center site. Anyway guys, that will do for this one. As I've mentioned, there are many more myths about the collapse of these towers, and I intend to cover them in their own separate debunking videos. I hope this video explanation helps to break down and simplify the collapse of the towers, especially for those who are skeptical of how these towers collapsed. Thanks for watching.